right. Well, welcome everyone in person, everyone joining us again on Zoom. I'm happy to introduce our next panel, our next conversation, really, not a panel here, with Paul Montero, who, and I hope I get this right, you've done so many amazing things over your accomplished career. Paul was the director of religious affairs for President Obama. He served as a liaison to religious and secular belief communities. Most excitingly, just a few months ago, Paul was nominated by President Biden to a position at the Justice Department, which he's in the midst of going through the confirmation for now, which we can chat about in a moment. He's a member among many other things he's done, the Prince George's County Public School Board of Education, on the Board of Governors for Wesley Theological Seminary, on the board for Helping Children Worldwide. And I will just start with those because there's another long list we could go through, currently at Howard University. So welcome, Paul. First of all, we'll give you
here. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks. And he's generously given us his time this afternoon to talk. We've titled it Religion and Diplomacy, which is some of his experience with President Obama. But we'll have a wide-ranging discussion. We'll sort of alternate back and forth with questions. So I think the easiest way to run it here, Dr. Monroe is going to bring up any Zoom questions that come in. And if at any point, we won't even save the questions to the end, if at any point you in the room have a question, just stand up and go to the mic. And the first moment I've got, I'll pause and turn it over to you because we want to have more of a discussion rather than you've been talked at a lot today. Now we can openly discuss this. So I think we'll start at the beginning, which is if you can sort of walk us through your journey back in, I believe it's 2006, you start working for who at the time was a certainly prominent but lesser known Senator, Barack Obama. How did you end up with him? What was your journey to that point to working for Senator Obama?
Sure, and it was a great sort of confluence of things that happened. But first, just thanks for inviting me to this. I'm a big fan of yours and I've been friends with Amelia for many, many years. So it's just good to be among family here. And thanks for tuning in. So yeah, 2006, I was about to finish law school and I figured, okay, if I'm going to be a DC lawyer, any good DC lawyer has Hill connections. It's a government town. You want to have some juice on the Hill. And I was looking at who I might work for. I'm from Maryland. So Senator Sarbanes was retiring and Senator Mikulski there wasn't any opportunity there. So I was like, who else could I work for? And yeah, at that point, Senator Obama was someone people were watching. I mean, his famous speech in 2004, no red America, no blue America, a lot of eyeballs on him thinking this guy, he's the only black senator at the time. He's going places. So I said, let me work for this guy because of that speech, the red America, blue America speech, but also a speech he gave earlier in 06 on religion and politics, the call to renewal speech on his view of how religion could complement politics and not be a source of division or demonization. And I just thought for a Democrat to give a speech like that, very thoughtful. And he's somebody I would want to work for because I grew up then and now my faith is very important to me. And so it was refreshing to hear him give a speech on how religion could be something that brings people together on issues of the common good. So I applied to work in his office as a legal intern, and I grew up Pentecostal. So I was like, I'm going to pray and fast until they call me back, half-day fast. And breakfast is my favorite meal. So because I knew my parents aren't even citizens, they're permanent residents. They came to this country from other countries. So they don't even vote. They don't give money to the party. They're not big cheeses in the political scene. You know, these jobs and internships, they usually go to people with connections. So I said, I'm gonna pray and fast until they call me back. 2.5 months went by. And the week I was gonna stop because I was hungry and tired of missing breakfast. That's when they called me for an interview that led to a position that led to 10 years of my life working for him.
Right, and that's, yeah, it was 10 years. And this might seem like an obvious question then, aside from just you're looking for political connections, like what was it about Obama specifically, about his worldview, anything that inspired you that not just someone to apply there, but like, this is the guy I'm going to spend the next 10 years working with.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Again, those two speeches, refreshing in the sense of the Red America, Blue America speech of we don't have to be antagonistic to each other. And these labels we put on people groups or states, entire groups of people, they're not helpful because people are individuals. The minute you sort of lump everyone together, you miss the nuance, you miss the humanity. So that 04 speech at the convention, and then that 06 speech on religion being a source of unity as opposed to disunity, and a way to say in a very diverse democracy, one of the most religiously diverse countries in the world, we've generally made it work. I mean, there are other countries throughout history and today where if you have a group of people that believe something different, they're not treated well. In some cases, they're not even allowed to stay. They're expelled or segregated to some degree. So why does it work here in America? Why hasn't religion blown this country up? Because we believe so many different things, and you have a huge growth of Americans that say, I don't ascribe to any belief community, the secular humanist community and others. And so America's always been a place for people that have different views to coexist. And so I just thought this is a guy who thinks deeply. He comes across on television as a very friendly person, and someone who I felt moved past some of the A-B conversation to say, well, maybe there's a different way we can approach these, and at least not get stuck in the same debates we've been having for decades that don't ever seem to move us forward. So those things kind of drew me to work for him.
You had a number of positions, with the Obama administration, and I'm curious about because you had just mentioned this religious diversity in the U.S., which is this incredible religious diversity. But one of your portfolios was working specifically with Afghanistan, if I recall. Or
Yeah.
What was that like? And I'm thinking the notion of like, we often think about this as at least a Christian nation, you hear some people talk about, but Obama did a lot of outreach to everyone. So what was your experience there?
Yeah, so I was doing the faith-based engagement with religious groups, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and I picked up the Arab American portfolio. And to be clear, Arab Americans are an ethnic group. They're not a religious group. And they told me that as soon as I took that role, because I started doing meetings with different groups. And as we lump people together, again, the labels even there kind of fall short, because if I say Arab American, I'm talking about Lebanese, Egyptian, people from Yemen, people from, Libya. And in those countries, remarkably diverse people, some Christian, some Muslim, some Orthodox, some, and so even the Arab American label was limiting. And so as I started doing the Arab American work, you come on this period, people look back at the sort of Arab Spring as sort of issues in Tunisia led to issues in other countries. And we were doing a ton of engagement with Arab Americans, many of whom prior to the Arab Spring, it was really hard to make entry into these communities, because I understand it. Like if you immigrated here from another country, where in that country of origin, the government was not your friend. You come here to America, you just want to run your business, raise your family, do your own. You don't want government sniffing around, because 2009, before Arab Spring, we were trying to make inroads with the Libyan community on the West Coast, the Lebanese community in Ohio, and saying, hey, I'm here from the federal government, I'm here from the White House. And we were coming out of a period where many people saw the federal government through the lens of 9/11. Oh, you're here to talk to me because there's some law enforcement component. You're here to talk to me because you feel like I'm doing something, and we worked really hard to try to desecuritize the engagement and say, we're not here as part of any law enforcement investigation. We're not here because we think you're any less patriotic. We're here because you're Americans too. And yet there's a whole bunch of federal agencies that never seem to knock on your door. And whatever law enforcement might be doing, all these other agencies should be doing at least as much, because you're Americans too. And so as Arab Spring kind of began, it became, I guess, quote unquote, easier to engage with the communities because they had something to say to us about our policy in these different countries, what we were doing wrong, what we were doing right, what we should be doing, who we should be talking to. And I remember just having whole meetings with, we would convene meetings for the Syrian American community. the Egyptian American community, and you get 100 folks in a room, you have 100 different opinions. And again, some of them have a viewpoint of, I remember in the Syrian American meetings, a number of the Syrian American Christians had the view, well, the government in Syria is not, the best, but they looked at Iraq and said, you had a Christian community in Iraq for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then when you removed Saddam Hussein, who was the only thing protecting this minority from other parts of the population that would be happy if there was no Christian minority in Iraq, you don't have a Christian minority in Iraq anymore. And so they looked at sort of the government as, this is the only thing keeping a majority from saying, this is not a place for you. And you had many other voices saying that the regime in Syria was not legitimate. They had taken actions that were, obviously devastating to their own citizens. So I got to the Afghan American communities because we just kept building out the engagement. Iranian Americans who are not Arab American, but the people of Iran living in America who are Americans, engaging them as Americans first, and similar with the Afghan American community.
To go back to a point you mentioned there, because Obama enters office after this period of the Patriot Act and a lot of tension in religious communities, and you alluded to, when you get the knock on the door from the government, it's usually not good. Typically,
people's pulse race a little bit, yeah.
Right, but you now are like the government. You're representing the U.S. government. Did you get much pushback, or how did you overcome apprehension or people who did not want to engage with the United States government on these issues, especially right after this era where it might have been fraught to do so?
Yeah, I think it's starting from a place of just respect. Like whether I'm doing my job or just talking to people, like don't show up asking for something. Like nobody likes that person. So if I show up at your doorstep saying, I've never met you, you don't know me, but I need you to do this for me, you're going to say, kick rocks. Like, who are you? Like, I don't want to talk to this guy. And so we would try to lead with engagement of, you don't have to do anything. We're here because you're Americans too. We're simply trying to share resources the government can offer. You have an issue with X policy or Y policy. This is the person you might want to talk to. If you want to talk to them, we can facilitate that. And here's our name and number if you ever want to be in touch. Can we add you to our listserv to share the things that we're doing on these, and then leave them alone? Because I think that was a way to instill trust of like, I'm not pushing my way in here. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm engaging you respectfully because you're a taxpayer like everybody else, and letting them, you have the number now. If you ever want to tell me something, okay, or you have the number now. The president's coming to your town. If you want to tell them something, you have a way to do that, and letting people respond. And I thought that approach worked because we couldn't be too forceful. Again, you just had a history you couldn't get around of folks feeling like there was a deliberate attempt by the federal government to just infiltrate houses of worship or communities. And I was very much part of just pure engagement, not investigation, not prosecution. And so over time, we built relationships that way.
So when you are, engaging with communities, so a lot of our students are in global affairs, want to get into some sort of government work. What were you hearing back? Like when people did engage, what were they saying about their thoughts on the US government or what you were doing?
It was often critical. And that's the thing. Like if you want to go down Engagement Street, be ready for people to tell you stuff you don't want to hear, or things that are not patting you on the back saying everything is great. And I think we were clear about, I had worked the campaign. So the presidential campaign was, it was rough. And, but engagement is about that. It's giving people an outlet to say, listen, you feel like the government should be doing this, or it's messing this up, or it should be, engaging with ABC. It's not to be given plaudits or compliments. It's to be given honest feedback, respectfully. We're not yelling in people's face, but often it was where they felt we were falling short. And that's a critical role to me, because I felt if you give people an opportunity to give constructive feedback or criticism, as people are sort of creating policies, maybe they'll be a bit more informed. There's a lot of good intentions, But that's a dangerous thing. Policy in the absence of feedback from people it can be a dangerous thing, because you have a good intention, but you don't think through how this policy is going to land on people or institutions. And then you have a problem on your hand that you didn't see coming. And so I always felt that we played a critical role of working with policymakers to say, listen, I know you're working on this thing, but can I set up a meeting where you hear from people that will be impacted by this thing? And sometimes that was a thing I had to navigate, because some policy folks, I get, nobody wants to be told this is wrong or this is short-sighted or X, Y, and Z. But especially as you got into the Arab American conversations, it's like, they would get pretty heated as folks are sharing things in real time of what's happening to their relatives in a war zone. They're not happy meetings. But I give a lot of credit to my National Security Council colleagues, Samantha Power in particular, Gail Smith in particular. Any group of Arab Americans that were coming to DC to share, they would sit for that meeting. Even if it was to hear, you're doing this terribly wrong, you should be doing this, why aren't you doing that? And I felt that the public engagement function was a real indispensable one to coming up with policy that was more informed.
On that same note there, so you're dealing with, in your position, you're sort of the buffer between the White House and the people, and then Congress, which often does its own thing, right? Did you ever encounter, and this is something students grapple with sometimes, of you've got this awesome job working at the White House, but there's a policy you're pursuing that you think is wrong personally. Did you encounter, you don't have to cite specifics, and how do you reconcile your own beliefs, whether it's faith beliefs or just moral beliefs, with the thing that you are now the public face of pushing forward if you're not 100% behind it?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason I decided to transition out of the White House. I mean, I had been there 5 years, so that was a long time. Most White House staff, they transition after 2 years. So, but, and I guess I'm talking about Syria a lot, it gets on my mind, but Syria then and now, it's an ugly situation. And one of the things we had talked about with the community was chemical weapons. If chemical weapons are used, that's a red line for the United States. That would change the approach to what's happening in Syria. And then in August of 2013, there was a chemical weapon attack, and it was on video. And so you saw women, children, men, seniors, it was terrible. And I had just finished traveling. I think I was in Ohio and California, meeting with Syrian American communities. And obviously they were very animated at that point. And one of the things I could hang my hat on was there's, if we cross this red line, maybe that's a different conversation. And it happened, and I understand the reasons why, the president took a different approach. But I just felt I wouldn't be effective anymore, having just gone to visit with these communities, telling them one thing, and then, not being the case. And so it wasn't antagonistic. It was just a recognition of, like, I don't have credibility. And so it's probably best if I, and I had been there 5 years, it was probably best to do something else. So.
Question? Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Go ahead.
I actually have quite some questions, so I can just list them out and you can answer them. My first question is, what databases were you using to interact with these populations? Who were you interviewing? Working class, business owners? Were they citizens, refugees, or asylees? How are you making these meetings accessible? Were there interpreters? How were you preparing to culturally interact with them? And what did you do, or how did you implement their feedback? And if it was negative, were folks blacklisted, or how would you deem them as a threat or not? And then my final comment is, you mentioned that the US did not expel people, unlike other countries, but what are your thoughts today on Title 42 and how the US is actually expelling immigrants at the border?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to try to go through in order. the first one was how did we come up with, what databases did we consult? And that was, again, when I was doing faith engagement with the Baptist Convention or the AME Church or the Catholic Church, all have websites, directories, who's who in a state. With the Arab American portfolio, there were a couple of national groups, and then a few like local regional ones, but no directory, no website, no this person speaks for the community, which gets to the broader issue of like, who decides who speaks for the community, right? Like, even if you talk about an advocacy group for the African American community or the Latino community, it's like, who speaks for them? You know, you have large groups that people know, but do they speak for every single person in the community? No. And so, especially in the Arab American community, as we were looking for partners to do the engagement with, we had to do shoe leather, sort of picking up the phone, calling around, you know, looking on the website, asking for referrals, because there was no database, there was no map. And to some degree, in some communities, there's a reason they deliberately did not want a map. They didn't want a directory. They just want to be left alone. And as time went on, especially as Arab Spring ramped up, protests were my best friend, in the sense of they would come to the White House and protest. So I would go out to Pennsylvania Avenue and just walk around with some fact sheets and my business card. I wasn't ashamed, because my thing is like, listen, there's a mechanism. You're angry about what the administration is doing, or you think it's great, or what you're protesting, so you're probably angry. But there's a way for you to be inside as well. And maybe we had never met, but if you ever want to be in touch, here's my card. Can we sign up for a listserv? So we just did like shoe leather type of stuff to try to build out, you know, a relationship map, because there wasn't a database. And then the other question, could you remind me of the third question?
There was one I had jotted down I thought was interesting, of like, how do you prepare for cultural interactions with groups that, you know, you don't know a lot about or aren't part of your culture? Are you briefed on that? Or
to some degree, I would try to do research on my own, but I was just amazed and just inspired by the radical hospitality that was shown to me, in the sense of people would take a meeting after a couple of calls. You come out and visit me, come to Dearborn, come to LA, come to Fresno, whatever, come to Brownsville. And I mean, you talk about roll out the red carpet, like they would eagerly try to share their culture with me, knowing I'm going to take that back and educate my colleagues. Again, once we got to a place where there was trust, and I never felt like, I certainly was not an expert on every culture, every tradition, every delicacy. I mean, but in these meetings, people were so eager to share their people, their history, their tradition, that it was a safe bet I didn't know. And then I would try to bake that into programming we did at the White House. A great example of that, the Sikh community, the Sikh community from India, the turbans, you know, and a very proud history. Their experience in America has not always been seamless, because, I mean, hate crimes are easily identifiable. The first person killed after 9/11 was a Sikh, you know, because someone misguided individual thought he was Muslim. And the bullying and harassment in schools of their children. And so just, you know, going to their temples, meeting them where they were comfortable, learning about their issues. It led up to us actually starting a White House recognition of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, who's the founder of Sikhism. It's sort of their, to use a gross analogy, it's Christmas for them. It's the birth of their founder. Major holiday in the Sikh tradition. We started the White House ceremony recognizing that tradition, like we celebrate Hanukkah, Christmas, Iftar during the holy month of Ramadan. And these things people can dismiss as like ceremonial, but to the Sikh community, they were seen at the highest levels of government. And so I always relished my role of, you're not doing it for me because I'm not important, but the role I play is to sensitize your government to a set of beliefs that you see the world through, or a set of values that, you know, animate you as a community. So I love doing that work, even when they were wrapped in criticisms. You know, we should be doing more to protect civil rights. We should be doing more to protect their children in schools. We should be doing more. A huge issue was the military, the armed services. The Sikh community has a proud military tradition. of protecting the vulnerable and the weak. But serving in the U.S. military has not been seamless because, you know, the beard is an issue. The turban's an issue. You know, the military is uniformity. Everyone wears the same thing. Your haircut's the same. You don't have facial hair, no headgear, generally speaking. And they want to serve in our military, serve the country, and yet there are policies that make it difficult for them. And so working with DOD, we were able to get some of those policies relaxed so they could serve without betraying their faith as they saw it, because the beard is not cosmetic. That's very important to their identity. The turban's not cosmetic. They wear a kirpan, a small blade, not cosmetic. That's an article of faith, but a small blade in a government building becomes a conversation, you know, people want to see differently. So, so many examples of how they were liberal in sharing their traditions with me because they knew my job is to sensitize their government to it. And then the question around the specific issue, you mentioned some specific legislation, or I didn't catch, but. Yeah, so I guess the point I was making when I made the comment was, we don't expel people based on religious belief, where you see other countries certainly do that. Because I'm currently going through a confirmation process, I'm not going to weigh in on any current legislations or policy debates. That's probably best for me. But the point I was making earlier was, where you see other countries segregate, eliminate, or remove people simply because of what they believe. Thank God that has generally not been the case in the United States. And so. I heard. Oh, yes. So again, talking about other administrations' policies, probably not a good idea for me to do so at this point.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a related question is, we often talk about how like the church and state are separate, that they should be separate in government. And when we look at U.S. foreign policy, it's often about, you know, the military and politics and these policies we're putting in place. How do you see, you know, faith and religion, or do you see faith and religion playing into or not playing into informing our approach to the world?
Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, like the Pilgrims weren't coming here for the weather, right? Like this country was birthed out of a group of people who couldn't practice as they saw fit, so they had to leave, and they came here. And Maryland, right across the border, is special because Maryland was the first written attempt in the Western Hemisphere to mandate religious tolerance. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1624 or something like that. You know, because you had a Catholic colony. You know, again, Catholics in England couldn't be, you know, have full citizenship rights. And so the Calvert family got a charter to do their Catholic thing in Maryland. That's how they got here. But then you had mostly Protestants living in it. And so that, you know, the Catholic Protestant divide, a real thing. And so from then till now, like religion, and people are rightly focused on race, as we should, but religion to me is equally, it's a force that has shaped this country from birth to today, and it pops up in different ways. You know, religion and, you know, our view of sacred days, religion and our view of who's a citizen, religion and our view of what's a just war to fight in. What about this alcohol thing? You know, is this demon rum is destroying the, you know, like religion and the role of women, religion and civil rights, the role of people of color in America. On and on and on. It pops up. And I mean, the LGBTQIA conversation, you know, religion and that, certainly religion and foreign policy. And so I'm fascinated with how, you know, faith is very much a part of how America sees itself and its role in the world. I mean, you get into the exceptionalism conversation. Yeah, so I think that's an area that's rich with a consequence for the country.
I'll pause if there's other thoughts. I don't want to keep being the only one to pepper Paul with questions here. You mentioned, and I mentioned when I introduced you, you were nominated for this position in the Justice Department. Can you give us some insight? We often hear and read about someone's nominated, they're going through the process, whatever you can share, what that looks like, what you have to prepare for. Do you have people briefing you on that and getting you ready? And are you nervous for the final confirmation?
Yeah, I'm definitely a bit nervous. I never thought I would even be in this situation. Again, my parents immigrated here from other places. I'm the first in my family to graduate high school. My parents met at McDonald's and had 5 kids. And so, yeah, like God is good. I mean, so even at the nervous points of the process, it's just like, hey, you brought me a long way, and so, yeah, I was asked to go back to the Justice Department to run the Community Relations Service, it's a little known part of the Justice Department that was written into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And, people writing that law knew, okay, so now you have a law that allows people of color, African Americans in particular, to have access to these spaces, hotels, restaurants, they felt that's not just going to happen. You're going to have violence, you're going to have resistance, you're going to have, folks maybe losing their lives because they don't want to accept this new law. So Title 10 of the Civil Rights Act creates the Community Relations Service, a team of mediators that deploy quickly to communities in crisis. We have racial tension that's about to boil over into violence. And the role of the Community Relations Service is to get in front of all of the stakeholders to a conflict, the business owner, the civil rights leader, the mayor, the police chief, get them together, and whoever else needs to be talking to one another to say, listen, how do we move forward as a community where the law is respected, people's rights are respected, and it's nonviolent? And so the early days of CRS were facilitating civil rights marches, like the Selma to Montgomery March, famous march in history. That was partly facilitated by CRS because you have a really long march route and all these little towns. And each town probably had a different rule for protest. In this town, it's stay on the sidewalk. In this town, it's stay on the street. In this town, it's single file. And this, and the minute you break that law, you're getting snatched up and locked up. So CRS would go 2 towns ahead. Okay, Sheriff, what's the rule in your town? Okay, got it. And relay it back to the marchers. Like, you're about to go into town A, stay on the sidewalk, single file. So the law in town A is respected. The people have the legitimate expression of their First Amendment right to protest. If they needed a permit, CRS got it. Just to be a quiet facilitator of, people expressing themselves and the law being respected. The mandate of CRS was expanded in 2009 under the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, named after Matthew Shepard, the gay man lynched for his sexual orientation, and James Byrd, the black man dragged to death in Texas by white supremacists. So that expanded the mandate to not just dealing with trying to resolve tension based on race, color, national origin, but also using education to prevent the commission of hate crimes through mediation, training, dialogue, when you have tension based on religion, sexual orientation, disability, and other protected classes. So it's a very big mission the agency has. And again, they work quietly because at all points, the community needs to figure out what's best for the community. But CRS is a resource to help find resolution to these conflicts. Hopefully, I did clear the Senate Judiciary Committee last week. So it goes now to the full Senate for a vote. And hopefully that's a favorable vote and I'll be able to serve again.
Yeah, let's hope. Well, congratulations on clearing the committee. And that's really interesting. I didn't know much about that. And we always see, at least what the public sees is often, the role of the government in a protest is to stop it. You have the police and the confrontation, not organizations facilitating this.
Yeah, I would.
Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you again for being here, fellow Howardite.
HU.
Again, Kimberly Monroe, Professor of History and Africana Studies. So this is a question that I have, right? Because you've worked in many different sectors, specifically higher education and in the Department of Justice. I wonder if you can speak to some of the challenges or differences rather that exist in both of these, distinctly different, careers, but also maybe speak to some of the challenges that you've had in trying to manage these different environments.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like legacy, in the sense of like the federal government is definitely, it's the federal government. I mean, you talk about massive bureaucracy, many divisions, the Justice Department is very large. And so just like navigating even inside the organization, who's doing this? Who should I be collaborating with on that? Certainly legacy systems in the sense of this is how we do things. This is how we've always done things. So this is how we should keep doing things. And it's similar with higher ed. I would say to some degree, you have a big organization, a university or a college, but you have departments and colleges within the university, and they don't always necessarily talk to one another, and so especially, and there's a way of doing things, and this is how we do things, and this is how we should always do things. And I think in both places, certainly with the federal government and the customer of the taxpayer, and definitely in higher ed with the customer of the student, they are not satisfied with the way things are done, and they want things done differently now. And for any large organization to change quickly, it's hard to do. And so I've seen some similarities in the sense of you're trying to pivot to a place where your customer is happier, your customer is satisfied, your customer is pleased with the service they're getting, their experience and all that. But in some cases, you're not turning fast enough because you can't, or you have people in the organization that don't want to turn. Right? And I've seen that too, where if I work someplace for 20 years, I might be like, this is how we do it. I don't want to do it differently. And you see how COVID has really disrupted everything, because I remember pre-COVID, some folks did not want to learn to do online class. They didn't want to do Zoom. University is the blackboard, and you come in this room and I'm going to teach you the knowledge you need, and then COVID happened and you had to be on Zoom, and it's interesting now, some people want to stay on Zoom. It's like, you didn't want to do Zoom in the first, but whatever, like people, it's just like being faced with something that made you choose. But unless and until you get to that point, folks, there's an inertia. You just kind of keep going the direction you're going. And again, you have a customer base that is very vocal about what you're not going to do or what you are going to do and when you're going to do it. And it's a challenging time for higher ed as more people are looking at the costs, the loans, what am I getting? Private sector's trying to come in here and say, you don't even need to go higher. You can come straight to me and I'll train you. And so I see those similar. You just have two legacy institutions that are trying to become more nimble for the 21st century. And it's, there's a lot of pressure to do it now quickly. Thanks for the question.
That was really thoughtful there. And it made me, actually, before I jump in, Anne, you going up to the mic?
Hello.
Hello.
Mine. Ann Pauley from Trinity. Thank you again for coming today. Really found this very interesting. I was reflecting about the position that you had in the Obama administration. And, it's about religion and diplomacy and reaching out to religious communities. And yet religion and the presidency has been a very complicated, fraught thing. And I think of President Kennedy. People were so concerned about the idea that there might be a Catholic president that he finally just had to give a speech to say, no, that's my religion and it gives me values, but I'm going to be the president and represent everyone. Obama had to do the same kind of speech because people were concerned about his church and his pastor. Biden is very openly Catholic. He goes to church often. He draws on that. How do you balance that? I mean, I think America in some ways wants to see leaders who have some values and some sense of religion, but they don't want it to be so strong that it might overpower. And yet we also need to reach out to all religious communities.
Yeah, no, that's a really complicated question because, yeah, you look at I mean, in our country, there is no religious test for office, so that's like explicit. And throughout history, you've had presidents of different belief traditions, orientations that don't fit neatly into, I mean, as many times as people invoke the founding fathers, these individuals had very nuanced views of the Christianity, the role of government, the role of the president, the role of the president as it relates to being a spiritual leader for the country or not at all. Lincoln had some very unique views of God's role in the Civil War and in individual lives. The Kennedy example, overcoming the suspicion of, will you be controlled by the Vatican? President Carter and his, sort of Southern Baptist, orientation, and President Obama. Yeah, it was, I mean, and that's why the 18 months of the campaign doing religious affairs, I mean, it was bumpy, but in a wonderful way to some degree, because we started going to a place of saying, like, listen, if you want to talk about morality in public policy, let's talk about it. And you can't limit the debate to one issue. We can talk about it all, but let's talk about it all. And there's a moral dimension to poverty in America. There's a moral dimension to immigration. And let's have the more fulsome conversation. And that's why that 06 speech, the call to renewal speech, was about that. Let's talk about it in a fulsome way. And during his presidency, I would track the percentage of Americans that believed him to be Muslim went up every year. We could have TD Jakes in the White House. We could have him going to church for Easter in a tan suit. But there was this growing number of Americans that believed, you're lying to me, you're secretly Muslim, as if there's something wrong with that, And so we would try to do as much as we could to signal this is a person whose Christian faith is very important to him. He would invoke it on many occasions, not just Easter or Christmas, but I mean, you remember the Charleston shooting, and just like when people are traumatized, they're looking for some reason to be hopeful. And so I felt like he authentically walked out his Christianity. But there were a percentage of people that didn't believe him. And what does that mean for the country? And then you had a different model with the last administration and then the current president. I think one of the things I'm watching really closely is you've never had this percentage of Americans unaffiliated. You've always had a Christian majority in America. Now you don't. And what does that mean for where we go from here? Like, just looking at it through history, you've always had most people identifying with some version of Christianity. And now you have a whole new cadre that says, don't label me with that. And so I don't know that there's a playbook for where we go. I'm actually just watching that closely because the things that were sort of commonalities in the past are not. So what we expect of a president in terms of he or she speaking out on issues of public policy with a faith lens or a values lens, I just think the country's changing in a way that we've never seen before. Yeah. So I would think that would change what I would expect to see from my president speaking. I mean, to me, quoting the Bible, I'm down with that. But to some people who might say, I mean, you saw this with the Peace Cross debate down in Bladensburg. A peace cross that's been there for about a century and challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court over that's public land. Why in the world is my taxpayer money going to light that or cut the grass or maintain it as it needs, retrofitting because it's very old. And I think the questions will come up more. I don't know what the answers will be, but the questions will come up more.
To go back, you had talked a lot about your call to serve, basically through government and otherwise, and you did that a number of different capacities at the White House. And then when you left, you went back to where you came up, where you grew up, and ran for office yourself.
Well, I left the White House and went to AmeriCorps first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I went to AmeriCorps and I loved that job. Any AmeriCorps alums in the house? Thank you for your service. I was the director of AmeriCorps Vista, and Vista, Volunteers in Service to America. People have heard of the Peace Corps. There's a program like the Peace Corps where you serve the country by staying here and going into a low-income community, tribal nation, urban, rural, suburban, and Vista to me was, I loved every minute of that job. And one of the big things I changed while I was there was, like, I grew up broke. You know, my parents, we didn't have a lot of money. We were on food stamps at different points. I was the free lunch kid in school. And one of the things that Vista did was, and it's very admirable, it's like the Peace Corps. We don't want to send people into a low-income community in a superior economic position, because then you're like, rich people coming in to save the poor people. That's not right. You should be in solidarity with the people because you're living in that community for a year. So we'll pay you a stipend that's tied to the poverty line based on that zip code. Very admirable, very admirable. Because it's like, okay, you're making what people in this zip code make. But we added the other piece of, like, you can't have any outside job, because if we find you supplementing your income, then you're making more than these people. You don't understand what it's like to live in. And I just never agreed with that. Because my thing is, like, listen, it's a very common thing for people in low income communities like I grew up in to have two jobs, you know, and it's not like people were working, you know, $1 billion paychecks. They're working at Starbucks, they're working at Applebee's, and they're working to stay in our program. You know, the effect of that policy was, okay, so we could only have people in our program that had money coming in from somewhere else that we couldn't see, specifically family. So it's like, wait a minute, I see all these people serving in AmeriCorps Vista. I love them all, but we know their parents are paying their rent. We know that. We don't do anything to them. But if I catch you working at Applebee's, you're fired. And imagine what that does to the core of people there, the demographics, the diversity. You're penalizing people who are just trying to stay. And we got rid of that policy while I was there, because there were whole states we didn't have a single person of color serving in it. And I'm like, okay, so there's not a single person of color interested in AmeriCorps Vista in this entire state? False. They are interested. They can't afford to serve in the program. That's the problem. And so we removed that prohibition with some guide rails. You know, don't go working. If you are working at $1 billion place or whatever, let us know, because we might need to look at that. But we got the data, and it showed, like, people were they were babysitting. They were working just to stay in. And that experience of serving in AmeriCorps Vista for a program that's been around 50 years is transformative. Like, people often serve in this program and they go on to do things working in that same space, working with new immigrant communities, working with domestic violence survivors, working with, you know, opportunity youth whose parents may be incarcerated, you know, and they find ways to keep serving. So to take that transformative opportunity off the table because people were simply born poor, I thought it's misguided. And I'm really glad we changed that policy. Yeah.
I suppose on that note, you know, if you were offering advice to our current crop of students who might want to go off and change the world, be leaders themselves, so AmeriCorps Vista.
Please check out AmeriCorps.
Yeah, and any other sort of general advice for you know, the students of this generation of wanting to follow a similar path and serving whatever community they call their own?
Okay, so grain of salt, because I haven't met any of you. I don't know I met Kim at the door, but I don't know Kim. So, like, we had a chat, but because that's what confused me a lot when I was coming up was, like, I would go around asking people for advice, like, what should I do next, whatever. And I would come away confused because people would give me advice and they would do it in a real prescriptive way. Like, hey, Paul, I know I just met you, but whatever, you need to do this, X, Y, Z. And it was usually what they did. And then I would come away, like, discouraged because I'm like, that doesn't even sound interesting to me, or I wouldn't be good at X, Y, Z, or I don't want to do that for a living. And I would come away feeling like, well, if I can't do that, then I can't do it, you know? And like, especially now in this generation of college students, to me, it's like a very a la carte generation. Like, you want to plan your own adventure. You don't want, like, you have option A, or you could do option B, or you want to come up with B prime and then have some Z and Y in there, you know. So I would just encourage you, because that's been my career has not been linear. I've had all these random jobs, not because I planned it out that way, but because, like, God opened up a door at this time, somebody gave me an opportunity that time, you know, one door closed. I ran for office and lost badly, but that got me to the Board of Education in Prince George's County, a school system that educated me to be the first in my family to get out of high school. So I would just encourage you, like, as you get advice from people and they tell you what to do, like, you should take the good, but don't feel like, because people project onto you and then you feel like stuck when it's like, well, it doesn't fit. It's like putting on a jacket that doesn't fit. Like, if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. Like, get another jacket or make another jacket. So I would just don't stifle that, like, part inside that's like, nah, I really don't. Or the opposite, positive side, like, this gives me life. I love doing this. I come alive doing that. Like, follow that, you know, and you might have to make your own way, but you're seeing with the economy now. I mean, and without naming names, I mean, there are whole companies that in the very near future, as they're all looking for workers, trying to figure out this remote work thing, they're coming to the conclusion, like, you all are in the driver's seat. Like, can we make you come to the office and do this and that? And no, we can't, because you can get a job somewhere else paying you the same money that lets you work wherever you want in your pajamas. And that's the world you're coming into, where you have leverage. And so I would say it's a world that very much needs creative solutions too. I mean, there are all these issues that kind of linger. And I feel like this a la carte generation is going to say, well, the reason it's not working is because you keep doing this, and it doesn't change. You need to try something different. And so I would just encourage you, get advice, but don't feel like you have to do it one way, because there's not one way to do anything.
Yeah, and preparing for all these jobs that don't even exist yet. I was just
Exactly. Yeah.
Speaking to someone who's like, when I was in school, there's no such thing as a podcast, and now I'm a paid
What's
podcast
that?
host.
Is it
Right?
Dean's? Yeah.
Yeah. But even on the note of, you know, you ran for, was it county executive?
County executive,
Yeah.
Prince George County.
Yeah, and you may not have won that race, but you've probably heard this story. One of your either events or in a debate, someone standing at the back, wearing the shirt of a different candidate after you had given your talk, said, like, I got to take this off. I like this guy. So
Yeah, I think that was my mom. But no, we got some friends. But I have no regrets, even though it was a long shot when I announced I was running for that office. But it was sort of like, you know what, life is short. Like, try, you know. And I went out there. I told my truth. I wasn't negative, because some people, they just run on, like, knocking the other people down, and I'm like, that's easy to do, and that doesn't help anybody. So I got a chance to, like, share my ideas. Didn't criticize anybody. I share where I thought differently, but yeah, it was actually fun, and we made a few friends.
Great. I'll pause maybe a final time as we slowly wrap things up here. If any other questions coming from the group. I see. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for being here. I definitely have heard that running for office is together. So it's not surprising to me, but great conversation. High places. Speaking of which, I understand that we did not particularly want to talk about the prior administration, and totally understand that. We saw in the media and so on that there was a rise in fundamentalist kind of Christianity that propelled that whole administration in the office. And that's always struck me as kind of possible. I wonder if you just have general thoughts and of how that somehow that view would propel that candidate to that place. I know this is not probably the last question. I apologize, but I think people will probably be analyzing that 100 years from now. And as an aside, Thomas Jefferson was very interested in Islam and actually told Ramadan president. Maybe that's something I.
That's accurate. Yeah, that's accurate.
Yeah, right. So those founding fathers were ecumenical, is that the word?
Yeah, Jefferson in particular had some very nuanced views of religion, to the point where he would cut out certain passages of the Bible he did not believe in. But yeah, he hosted the Ramadan iftar. So during the holy month of Ramadan, Muslims fast during the day. The meal they break the fast with is called the iftar. And so he would host that at the White House. And that was a tradition President Obama continued doing. But well, it's certainly a deep question, because if I understand it right, I guess I would answer it this way. One of the things about that, again, that call to renewal speech in 2006 was, Senator Obama at the time pointing out, it's understandable how religion has been a source of contention, because it doesn't always allow us both to be right. Like at the end of the day, it's you're right or I'm wrong, or vice versa. And his point is, one of the points he makes in the speech is just, in a pluralistic democracy, it's totally fine. It should be the case. People with belief coming to the public square, coming to Congress, coming to the State House, and saying, my faith tells me this is so, this is true. But what we can never do is say, well, that's enough. That's the end of the argument. Because not everyone believes as you do. You should bring your whole self, as should I, as should everybody, informed by faith or whatever belief or value set people have, but recognize with some humility, we don't all believe that here. And so let's figure out how to get to a place where, but to simply quote a scripture as the reason we should or shouldn't do something, in a pluralistic democracy, it's never been that way. And so I think, to your observation about forces that propel political parties, I mean, you certainly see, folks seeing events in the world, events in the country through a lens of that was their chosen candidate. And again, I just keep coming back to you do have, especially as you break it out by generation, like under 40, this generation, millennials and the Gen Z, I mean, very different attitudes and very different adherence and observance of religious traditions. So where are we going? I don't know. But you've never had that in the country. So I think religion will always be a force in our public life and our national life. I'm just eager, as a student of sort of religion and policy making, how that segment of society, as they grow, weigh in on issues, question things that people haven't questioned before. And so I'm tracking that one closely, but I that's not a perfect answer to your question, but okay. Yeah, thanks.
I think that's a wonderful sentiment to maybe end on. But if I can ask one more quick question, I had opened this morning's session by explaining there was this journalist and peace activist in the 1960s who, when interviewing a prominent statesman or politician, would ask, in your lifetime, what have you learned? Do you have any, the big question of words of wisdom to wrap on?
And I've learned God is real. I mean, there's so many examples, large and small. When I think about where I started, Northwest Park Apartments over on New Hampshire Avenue and Piney Branch Road, and getting evicted from our apartment at a young age, not having money for this or that, electricity cut off, and just to it's always clear, like looking backwards, when you're in it, it's just tough, And so, I mean, I have to give that as my answer. I've been blessed to be in places and spaces that I wanted to be in, but there was no clear way to get there. And so it's not because I worked hard or because I'm smart. God is real, and that's my truth. Yeah, that's how I would answer your question.
Great. Well,
thanks, y'all.
thank you for sharing your time with us.